Hi, I'm Rashonda Cade. This is Reading with Rashonda. We are reading Behind the Scenes by Elizabeth Keckley. We are on chapter 10. It's a toss up if we're going to make it all the way through this. So I really guess that just depends on what kinds of tangents I go off on. But let's start off on a good foot. Did I say chapter 10? It's chapter 9. It clearly says IX, not just X. Chapter 9, Behind the Scenes. Some of the freedmen and freedwomen had exaggerated ideas of liberty. To them, it was a beautiful vision, a land of sunshine, rest, and glorious promise. Shouldn't it be? I mean, I get that's not the reality, but dang, shouldn't it be like that? They flocked to Washington, and since their extravagant hopes were not realized, it was but natural that many of them should bitterly feel their disappointment. The colored people are wedded to associations, and when you destroy these, you destroy half of the happiness of their lives. Bold statement. Had anybody besides a colored person herself said this, I would probably be in an uproar. And she's talking about colored people as if she knows them intimately, but as if she is not one of them herself. Although I will say, being newly freed versus having been free for a while makes a difference in how you move through life. But she's saying that all Black people are wedded to associations, and when you destroy these, you destroy half of the happiness in their lives. I mean, isn't everyone wedded to associations? Is it really just Black people, or do Black people feel that more prominently than others? I don't know. They make a home and are so fond of it that they prefer it, squalid though it be, to be the comparative ease and luxury of a shifting, roaming life. Well, the emancipated slaves, in coming north, left old associations behind them, and the love for the past was so strong that they could not find much beauty in the new life so suddenly open to them. That reminds me of the children of Israel while they were wandering in the desert. If they said it once, they said it 1,000 times. Moses, why did you bring us out here to die? We don't have any food. We don't have any water. We were so much better off in Egypt where we were enslaved. Every time I read that, the children of Israel are not any different than I am. I probably too would have been like, why did you bring me out here to die? But my gosh, all the miracles God did for them. I mean, he parted a whole sea and they walked across on dry land. We could just stop there, but there were so many more. There was manna, there was quail, there was water from rocks. There was their feet not swelling and their shoes not wearing out for 40 years. I mean, my feet swell in a day. For 40 years, their feet didn't swell. Maybe we won't make it through this chapter. I've already gone off on a couple of tangents. Let me keep reading. Well, the emancipated slaves in coming north left old associations behind them, and the love for the past was so strong that they could not find much beauty in the new life so suddenly open to them. Thousands of the disappointed huddled together in camps, fretted and pined like children for the good old times. In visiting them in the interests of the Relief Society, of which I was president, they would crowd around me with pitiful stories of distress. Often I heard them declare that they would rather go back to slavery in the South and be with their old masters than to enjoy the freedom of the North. I believe they were sincere in these declarations because dependence had become a part of their second nature, and independence brought with it the cares and vexations of poverty. I love the juxtaposition of the words dependence and independence. I have thought about the state of slavery as being dependent on somebody for many things: food, clothing, shelter. You really couldn't get that for yourself. But when I hear independence, I really just think of freedom. I think of it as synonymous with liberty. But if we break down the word independence, in, that prefix means without. So independence means without dependence. And that to me really isn't a synonym for freedom or liberty, because we must depend on each other in society. Okay. My wheels are turning. I was very much amused one day at the grave complaints of a good old simple-minded woman fresh from a life of servitude. She had never ventured beyond a plantation until coming north. The change was too radical for her, and she could not exactly understand it. She thought, as many others thought, that Mr. and Mrs. Lincoln were the government and that the president and his wife had nothing to do but to supply the extravagant wants of everyone that applied to them. I can't imagine thinking that. I like the thought that you could apply to the president for something, though. I mean, and maybe back in the day you could. I could not. I could not apply to any sitting U.S. president or likely any previous U.S. president for anything. Like, that's not the way it works. I have written letters to presidents. I did not get a response from President Trump. I did get a response from President Obama. It wasn't from President Obama. It was, his people or AI or whatever, but I was happy to get a response. I barely get it. I got a response once from the mayor. It was like, "Dear citizen." Anyway, we're going to read this chapter. We are going to read this chapter. She thought, as many others thought, that Mr. and Mrs. Lincoln were the government and that the president and his wife had nothing to do but to supply the extravagant wants of everyone that applied to them. The wants of this old woman, however, were not very extravagant. "Why, Mrs. Keckley," said she to me one day, "I has been here 8 months, and Mrs. Lingham ain't even give me one shife. One shife. One shife. SHIFE. This is written in, I forgot the word. Vernacular? That's not the word I'm looking for. Lots of things we've read have been written this way. And dialect, that's the word. This is written in dialect. At any rate, I don't know what shife is. Maybe we will learn from our context clues. SHIFE. I'm trying to think what that sounds like. Like, I has been here 8 months and Mrs. Lingham ain't even given me one shife. I don't know. Bliss God, children, if I had known that the government and Mr. and Mrs. Government, we call them the Lincolns Mr. and Mrs. Government. If I had known that the government and Mr. and Mrs. Government was going to do that our way, I never would have come here in God's world. My old missus give me 2 shifts every year. Oh, maybe like a shift, like a dress? Because that makes sense that she would get 2 dresses every year. We're going with shift as in a dress. I could not restrain a laugh at the grave manner in which this good old woman entered her protest. Her idea of freedom was 2 or more old shifts every year. We deduced it correctly. Go us. As my daughter would do. She pats herself on the back, literally. She is hilarious. If you have never met her, you should. She's a fantastic person, as is my son. Northern readers may not fully recognize the pith of the joke. On the southern plantation, the mistress, according to established custom, every year made a present of certain undergarments to her slaves, which articles were always anxiously looked forward to and thankfully received. The old woman had been in the habit of receiving annually 2 shifts from her mistress, and she thought the wife of the President of the United States very mean for overlooking the established custom of the plantation. That's interesting. If we think about slaves as being dependent on their masters for food, clothing, shelter, I never really thought about being dependent on the customs of the institution of slavery. If you get 2 shifts every year from what is tantamount the government to you, why wouldn't the government give you 2 shifts every year? That is really interesting. I've never thought about it that way before. But would people, newly freed people, expecting the government to operate like a plantation? Why? Because the plantation is the only thing they knew. While some of the emancipated blacks pined for the old associations of slavery and refused to help themselves, others went to work with commendable energy and planned with remarkable forethought. That was really something that people said of freed men and women, that they weren't industrious and they refused to help themselves. There are always people who will not be industrious and who will refuse to help themselves. So I'm not saying that people like that didn't exist But like this woman, if what you're used to is somebody giving you two dresses every year, you're going to wait for somebody to give you two dresses every year and spend your time doing something different. It's not a refusal to help yourself, it's a misunderstanding of the way things work. And then sometimes once you understand the way things work and the way that things are stacked against you, you honestly might just feel so overwhelmed by all of it. The simplest thing to do is not to do anything. I don't know about you. My life has never been as dire as anything we're reading. I'm not even trying to make that association. Ooh, association. But what I am saying is when things seem too much and I am overwhelmed, I don't see a way through or a way out, I definitely have my times where I just shut down. It's not my greatest habit. It's not the most Christian thing I could do. And I am getting better at it with God's help. But what I'm saying is, I understand. All right. So, but here we're talking about the emancipated Black people who pined with remarkable forethought. I'm sorry, who planned with remarkable forethought. They built themselves cabins, and each family cultivated for itself a small patch of ground. The colored people are food of domestic life. That's actually, oh, fond. I was like, food of domestic life. The colored people are fond of domestic life, and with them, domestication means happy children, a fat pig, a dozen or more chickens, and a garden. I'm not mad at that. I like domestic life and I like my children happy. I don't have a pig, nor do I have chickens, although I want chickens. I don't think I'm allowed to have a pig where I live, but I do want chickens. And I have a garden. And those hallmarks of domesticity, so to speak, really do bring me joy. I am happy I can do that for my family and myself. All right, we'll keep reading. Whoever visits the Freedmen's Village now in the vicinity of Washington will discover all of these evidences of prosperity and happiness. The schools are objects of much interest. Good teachers, white and colored, are employed, and whole brigades of bright-eyed, dusky children are there taught the common branches of education. These children are studious, and the teachers inform me that their advancement is rapid. I number among my personal friends 12 colored girls employed as teachers in the schools at Washington. The Colored Mission Sabbath School, established through the influence of General Brown at the 15th Street Presbyterian Church, is always an object of great interest to the residents of the capital, as well as to the hundreds of strangers visiting the city. In 1864, the receptions again commenced at the White House. For the first 2 years of Mr. Lincoln's administration, the president selected a lady to join in the promenade with him, which left Mrs. Lincoln free to choose an escort from among the distinguished gentlemen that always surrounded her on such occasions. This custom was at last discontinued by Mrs. Lincoln. I'm sure it was. If she was jealous, like we were reading before, why would she allow that? I'm going to take a moment. I have a note here. Okay, my note says, was Keckley one of those who had all kinds of light skinned ideas and tests? Okay, I think that came later, but so what I'm asking here, like as we're listening to Elizabeth Keckley, she sounds condescending of the newly emancipated Black people. She wants to help them. Very laudable. She sounds like she thinks she's better than they are. And I've mentioned the uplift movement before, which was really free Black people or Black people who had been free longer, who had more means, who had more education, helping Black people who didn't. It's very laudable. And many of the institutions that we have currently and much of the progress that Black people made in the country wouldn't exist without that. But there was also kind of this I'm better than you, and that often got wrapped up in colorism and who was lighter and who was darker. So that's what my question was that I wrote to myself whenever I read this book. And I wonder things like that. But right now, and I want you to ponder that too. It's important to bring up, it's important to know, it's important to understand. But right now, we're going to keep reading about Mrs. Lincoln, who discontinued allowing Mr. Lincoln to have some woman be his escort on the promenade. Elizabeth, I was sewing in her room and she was seated in a comfortable armchair. Elizabeth, I have been thinking over a little matter. As you are well aware, the president at every reception selects a lady to lead the promenade with him. Now it occurs to me that this custom is an absurd one. On such occasions, our guests recognize the position of the president as first of all. Consequently, he takes the lead in everything. Well, now, if they recognize his position, they should also recognize mine. I am his wife and should lead with him. And yet he offers his arm to another lady in the room, making her first with him and placing me second. The custom is an absurd one, and I mean to abolish it. The dignity that I owe to my position as Mrs. President demands that I should not hesitate any longer to act. Mrs. Lincoln kept her word. Ever after this, she either led the promenade with the president or the president walked alone or with a gentleman. The change was much remarked, but the reason why it was made, I believe, was never generally known. In 1864, much doubt existed in regard to the reelection of Mr. Lincoln, and the White House was besieged by all grades of politicians. Mrs. Lincoln was often blamed for having a certain class of men around her. I have an object in view, Elizabeth, she said to me in a reference to this matter. In a political canvass, it is policy to cultivate every element of strength. These men have influence and require influence to re-elect Mr. Lincoln. I will be clever to them until after the election, and then, if we remain at the White House, I will drop every one of them and let them know very plainly that I only made tools of them. Wow, okay. They are an unprincipled set, and I don't mind a little double dealing with them. Okay, ma'am. Does Mr. Lincoln know what your purpose is? I asked. God, no. He would never sanction such a proceeding, so I keep him in the dark and will tell him of it when all is over. He is too honest to take the proper care of his own interests, so I feel it to be my duty to electioneer for him. Well, at least his wife says that the honest Abe idea is true. Mr. Lincoln, as everyone knows, was far from handsome. Let's just put that out there. So I saw a Twitter feed the other day that had many of the previous presidents dressed in it was AI art, I assume it was AI art. Anyway, each of the presidents had a mullet and had more kind of a cool appearance about them. Abraham Lincoln's was awesome. He looked really good. I was like, oh, excuse me, Mr. Lincoln. Joe Biden looked really good. Clinton looked really good. I enjoyed all of them. I wasn't feeling Barack Obama's hair. Like the style was okay, but I don't know. I wasn't feeling it, but it cracked me up. I don't know the person's Twitter handle, so I apologize for that, but it was really something interesting to behold. Mr. Lincoln, as everyone knows, was far from handsome. He was not admired for his graceful figure and finely molded face, but for the nobility of his soul and the greatness of his heart. Those are good things to be admired for. His wife was different. He was wholly unselfish in every respect, and I believe that he loved the mother of his children very tenderly. He asked nothing but affection from her, but did not always receive it. When in one of her wayward, impulsive moods, she was apt to say and do things that wounded him deeply. If he had not loved her, she would have been powerless to cloud his thoughtful face or gild it with a ray of sunshine as she pleased. We are indifferent to those we do not love, and certainly the president was not indifferent to his wife. I find that to be true. I'm not necessarily indifferent to people that I don't love, but if I don't really care about you, what you say and do doesn't really affect me. Not personally. I don't mean if you're killing people or something. I don't mean that, but day to day, like me or don't like me, if I don't really care all that much about you, it doesn't make that much difference to me. So it seems that the president felt the same way. We are indifferent to those we do not love, and certainly the president was not indifferent to his wife. She often wounded him in unguarded moments, but calm reflection never failed to bring regret. Mrs. Lincoln was extremely anxious that her husband should be reelected president of the United States. In endeavoring to make a display becoming her exalted position, she had to incur many expenses. Mr. Lincoln's salary was inadequate to meet them, and she was forced to run in debt, hoping that good fortune would favor her and enable her to extricate herself from an embarrassing situation. She bought the most expensive goods on credit, and in the summer of 1864, enormous unpaid bills stared her in the face. We mentioned before that being president was really very expensive. You Back in this time, you had to pay for everything yourself, and it was expected that you were hosting these lavish parties and that it all came out of your own pocket. What do you think about the election, Elizabeth? She said to me one morning. I think that Mr. Lincoln will remain in the White House 4 years longer, I replied, looking up from my work. There was really nothing else to reply. That was the only answer she could have given. What makes you think so? Somehow I have learned to fear that he will be defeated because he has been tried and he has proved faithful to the best interests of the country. The people of the North recognize in him an honest man, and they are willing to confide in him at least until the war has been brought to a close. The Southern people made his election a pretext for rebellion, and now to replace him by someone else after years of sanguinary war would look too much like a surrender to the North. So Mr. Lincoln is certain to be reelected. I don't exactly follow the logic about the Southern people. The Southern people made his election a pretext for rebellion, and now to replace him by someone else after years of sanguinary war would look too much like a surrender to the North. To would look too much like a surrender of the North. I oh okay, a surrender of the North. I was thinking a surrender to the North, a surrender of the North. So if the Northerners did not reelect President Lincoln, it would look like they were saying he was in the wrong regarding the war, and it would look like a surrender. Okay. So Mr. Lincoln is certain to be reelected. He represents a principle, and to maintain this principle, the loyal people of the loyal states will vote for him, even if he had no merits to commend him. Your view is a plausible one, Elizabeth, and your confidence gives me new hope. If he should be defeated, I do not know what would become of us all. To me, to him, there is more at stake in this election than he dreams of. What can you mean, Mrs. Lincoln? I do not comprehend. Simply this. I have contracted large debts of which he knows nothing, and which he will be unable to pay if he is defeated. What are your debts, Mrs. Lincoln? They consist chiefly of store bills. I owe altogether about $27,000. $27,000 is a lot of money today. Are a lot of people in that debt and more? Absolutely. It's actually not even all that uncommon. But what was $27,000 back in 1864? I am going to stop recording for a moment and I'm going to look that up. I'll be right back. All right, I'm back. The internet said that $27,000 in 1864 would be almost $515,000 today. That is more than $500,000. And I have to ask, have you been paying Mrs. Keckley? Have you? Have you? Have you been paying Mrs. Keckley? All right. What are your debts, Mrs. Lincoln? They consist chiefly of store bills. I owe altogether about $27,000. The principal portion at Stewart's in New York. You understand, Elizabeth, that Mr. Lincoln has but little idea of the expense of a woman's wardrobe. He glances at my rich dresses and is happy in the belief that the few $100s that I obtain from him supply all my wants. I must dress in costly materials. The people scrutinize every article that I wear with critical curiosity. Ain't that the truth? I mean, I don't know where she could practice more economy, but you do have to dress in a certain way, and if you don't, the people will be all over you. Mm. The very fact of having grown up in the West subjects me to more searching observation. To keep up appearances, I must have money, more than Mr. Lincoln can spare for me. He is too honest to make a penny outside of his salary. Consequently, I had and still have no alternative but to run in debt. And Mr. Lincoln does not even suspect how much you owe? God, no. This was a favorite expression of hers. Right, this is the second time we've seen her say it. God, no. This was a favorite expression of hers, and I would not have him suspect. If he knew that his wife was involved to the extent that she is, the knowledge would drive him mad. He is so sincere and straightforward himself that he is shocked by the duplicity of others. He does not know a thing about any debts, and I value his happiness, not to speak of my own, too much to allow him to know anything. If he knew I was so deeply in debt, he would be unhappy. I'm sure he would be. And I would be unhappy too. So let's not tell him. This is what troubles me so much. If he is reelected, I can keep him in ignorance of my affairs. But if he is defeated, then the bills will be sent in and he will know all. And something like a hysterical sob escaped her. Mrs. Lincoln sometimes feared that the politicians would get hold of the particulars of her debts and use them in the presidential campaign against her husband. Sure would happen today. And when this thought occurred to her, she was almost crazy with anxiety and fear. When in one of these excited moods, she would fiercely exclaim, "The Republican politicians must pay my debts. Hundreds of them are getting immensely rich off the patronage of my husband, and it is but fair that they should help me out of my embarrassment. I will make a demand of them, and when I tell them the facts, they cannot refuse to advance whatever money I require." That sounds like a really bad idea to me. This sounds like a really bad idea to me, but what do I know? Oh, hmm. Don't do it, Mrs. Lincoln. I wonder if this is the big shebang that the book opened with, that Mrs. Lincoln made her bed and has to lie in it and all of that talk. I wonder if this is it, just the debt, or that she was going to go to the Republicans and say, "You need to pay my debt." They'll be like, "No, I don't." Have you seen the movie The Replacements with Keanu Reeves and other people? It's it's about a football team of replacement players when the professional team has gone on strike. But there's a scene where one of the professional players, who is an awful person, but anyway, one of the professional players says to one of the replacement players, "You're going to pay for that." And the replacement player says, "No, I'm not." And that's what's going on in my head with Mrs. Lincoln approaches the Republicans. "You're going to pay my debt." "No, I'm not." Anyway, that was me and all of my tangents today. This is Behind the Scenes with Elizabeth Keckley. I'm Rashonda Cade, and this is Reading with Rashonda. Until next time.